This is Electric Universe Eyes, and today I'm going to narrate Chapter 18, Lowering the Drawbridge, from the book The Electric Sky, written by Donald E. Scott. When astronomers realized they could accurately predict solar and lunar eclipses by using the mathematics of Johannes Kepler, and also explain why the planets move as they do by using Newton's law of gravitation, they thought their quest for knowledge about how the cosmos works was just about complete. They then retreated into a fortress-like mentality, pulling up the drawbridge behind them. Later they allowed Einstein into the castle and tried to emulate his mathematics. Some particle physicists gained entry too, provided they swore to support and defend the theories of the resident astronomical wizards who lived behind the walls. Mystical tales of black holes and strange matter began to float down to the public from the battlements. Tales that the public did not understand, but that added great stature to those telling them. Astronomers never again allowed outsiders into the castle. It is time for the drawbridge to be lowered again so that astronomers and astrophysicists can learn about experimental plasma physics. That they need to know about the electrical properties of the cosmos ought to be abundantly clear from reading this book. But this is just one aspect of a more widespread and insidious problem that pervades much of today's scientific world. The advent of big science has made enormous research projects possible. Two bicycle makers may have been able to design and create the first flying machine, but they never could have created a rocket capable of landing on and returning from the moon. That took billions of government-supplied dollars and large research and development teams and facilities. Big science has also brought with it big control. No one wants to waste huge sums on dubious lines of investigation, so tight reins are understandably placed on the expenditure of these vast sums. But these constraints have led to a narrow focusing of science. Those empowered to hold those reins are excessively tight in some ways and much too loose in others. Biologist Rupert Sheldrake describes it this way. In the 19th century, Darwin, for example, put forward radical ideas. He didn't have to deal with the science establishment because at that time amateurs like him worked independently in whatever area interested them. He never had an academic post. He didn't have a government grant. He worked as an independent scientist from his country home in Kent, and he could say what he liked. Nowadays, very few scientists have that independence. Younger ones are dependent on short-term contracts and on the patronage of their superiors, which makes them very frightened, very conservative, very afraid to step out of line. More senior scientists are dependent on the flow of grants and funds, which depends on yet higher-up people in the science establishment approving their work and thinking they are good chaps and so on. And the effect of all this is to make people extraordinarily frightened of stepping out of line. Science, in its ideology, sees itself as doing fearless exploration of the unknown. Most of the time, it's a fearful exploration of the almost known. Sheldrake also said recently that big, quote, science has a kind of Stalinist mentality, a kind of central committee, planning out research strategies and awarding grants in an atmosphere of fear throughout the scientific community. People don't dare to step out of line, end quote. This too tight control of what is acceptable and what is not amounts to destructive censorship. Potentially fruitful areas of research are aborted before they can be born. However, when it comes to finding completely abstract and non-testable work in areas such as string theory, the reins are much too loose. Purely abstract research, where no testing in the real world is possible or even desired by those investigators, ought to receive only limited government funding. There should be a statute of limitations on such funding. If wealthy universities and private foundations want to endow these sorts of purely intellectual activities in perpetuity, it should be their option to do so. We cannot, nor would we want to, return to the days of Darwin. Big science is with us to stay. But there are a couple of ways to return it to a more reasonable course, a true search for knowledge. Senior scientists who have become mired in established thought must be persuaded to be more open to new ideas. If non-testable sciences were to become more tolerant of reasonable alternative ideas, it would lead to a more openly aware scientific world. But scientists are human, and as we have seen, it is difficult to convince someone to reverse course or admit new ideas in a closed field wherein he has been a mover and shaker for decades. It may well be that the challenges we have described in these pages will slowly seep into the purview of younger, more open-minded students who will eventually attain research positions at major institutions. After achieving some degree of security there, these people may then be able to quietly introduce some of these ideas. One can hope they will be honest enough to give credit where credit is long past due, to the Alphins, Langmuirs, Birkelands, and Perats, and not just say those ideas are now, quote, well known. Right now, however, if you try to obtain an entry-level position on the faculty of any prestigious department of astronomy and suggest that the Big Bang Theory may be flawed, if you reveal that the Halton Arps photographs interest you, if you refer to the possibility that electric fields and currents might be involved in the workings of the cosmos, you will be quietly, but quickly, shown to the door. Political commentator David Horowitz, speaking about the structure of institutions of higher learning, asked, "How has this monopoly of the academic campus come about? To begin with, universities are feudal institutions whose organizational structures are hierarchical and collegial and thus closed to scrutiny and oversight. The dean confessed that there was absolutely nothing he could do to alter the situation. Faculty hiring is controlled by senior members of the faculty itself at the departmental level. Unless bound by greater scruples, they can hire, and do hire, only people who agree with them and share their prejudices." Horowitz was talking about the political prejudices of university faculties, but his comments are equally relevant in all branches of the academy and science. The public thinks that the majority activity of pure science is the dispassionate search for new truths. The sad reality is that these days the search for truth usually takes a backseat to other activities. What researchers do now for the most part is try to survive. This means that they must constantly seek funding from friendly peer reviewers. Scientists strive to attain the admiration of their colleagues in competing institutions and government funding agencies. They seek mutual acceptance and stature as a means of survival. They seek, and many times are successful in attaining, control of funding agencies. Science needs to be encouraged to revisit the principles that theories can be revised or even discarded without dishonoring the investigators who developed those earlier paradigms. It is perfectly proper for revisions in any scientific field to be sparked by new researchers, even those from outside that field, especially when they are people of the intellectual stature of Christian Birkeland and Nobel laureates Hannes Alfvén and Irving Langmuir. Rather than feelings of shame, true scientists should be proud of reversing course. Quote, "Once you embrace unpleasant news, not as a negative but as evidence of a need for change, you aren't defeated by it, you're learning from it." End quote. You should be proud of it. If persuasion and education do not achieve a more open mindset in those who steer the ship of science, higher authority can enforce changes in the leadership of funding agencies. When non-testable, speculative science competes for funding with experimentally testable research, the testable work ought to receive priority, at least from the governmental sources. Most aspects of plasma cosmology are testable in the laboratory. This is the kind of research that NASA should fund. They should be more circumspect in providing support for areas in which it is difficult or impossible to test hypotheses. Congress could direct such a change. Billions of taxpayer dollars have been used to support 50 years of failed research on controlled nuclear fusion experiments. A good portion of this research is based on erroneous fundamental assumptions about how plasma and magnetic fields interact. A similar huge investment in astrophysics has produced little more than a cascade of whimsically named invisible entities, mysterious mechanisms, stories about magnetic bubbles, and other strange complexities, all case-hardened in opaque mathematics. If these fields had been more open to new ideas, they would have had better chances of achieving meaningful results. Perhaps each funding agency ought to be required to set aside a certain small amount each year to be awarded only to research proposals that challenge accepted theories. This is not to advocate the financial support of baseless bad science, but rather of ideas that are well-founded on previous work, hopefully on experimental work. Rupert Sheldrake has suggested that if only 1% of the money now being distributed by scientific funding agencies were to go to research that was of real interest to taxpayers, science would become more popular. At present, tax money generally goes to research sought by the scientific establishment, corporations, and government institutions. The administration of science is neither accountable to those who pay for it nor carried out in an unbiased way. Sheldrake's proposal suggests that 99% of research funds continue to be allocated in the usual way, but he suggests that a board representing a wide range of interests, including non-governmental organizations, schools, and voluntary associations, allocate the one remaining percent. A possible name would be the National Discovery Center. Individuals could submit suggestions over the internet. Local and national organizations could lobby for projects. Potential subjects for research could be discussed in the news media. Sheldrake feels this new venture would make science more attractive to young people, stimulate interest in scientific thinking and hypothesis testing, and help break down the depressing alienation from science that many people feel. Whether the funding is directed to, quote, address the curiosity of lay people, end quote, or toward the goal of supporting more scientifically based but paradigm-challenging research is really not all that important. What is crucial is that, one way or another, we must break the monopoly that establishment science now has over which hypotheses and phenomena can be looked into and which cannot. The late renowned astronomer Dr. Thomas Gold proposed instituting a formalized procedure where informed, scientifically astute people from outside an area could judge whether a new idea could be funded for investigation. He called this formalism a scientific court. Gold said, "Where a lot is at stake, where a subject has been driven into an alley, one must set up a science court where the different viewpoints would be heard, would be argued by the protagonists of each one, with carefully prepared work. The different viewpoints could be judged, not by others working in that same field, which would merely take you back to the herd, but would be judged by a group of very knowledgeable and very competent scientists distributed over other fields, but with enough general competence to be able to understand the detailed arguments of the field in question. I would be much happier to have subjects surveyed every now and again by a jury of that kind. It has to be a scientific jury because it would have to understand detailed scientific arguments, but they do not have to be, and should not be, from the field in which the decision is to be made." Gold also criticized the peer review system's constrictive grip on new ideas. Quote, "Why is it thought that the peer review system would work for science? How about trying to make a peer review system work for other forms of endeavor? Suppose we had a National Foundation for the Arts, and every painter had to apply to it to get his canvas and his brushes and his paints. How do you suppose that would work?" End quote. Perhaps one way to break the cycle of the peer review systems awarding all government and most private funding to only those scientists who promote the dominant theory is to encourage the practice of wealthy patrons supporting new, less mainstream scientific investigations, as the Medici family did for Galileo. I know a bit about astronomy and a fair amount more about electric plasma. I have no formal training in archaeology, anthropology, or geology, but I suspect the shoe fits there as well as in astronomy and cosmology. This is because all the experiences I have ever had with representatives from those areas of science that deal with non-testable past and distant realms have resulted in my being told with supreme authority that everything those experts were saying was accurate, correct, and precisely known. And they brook no suggestions of alternative hypotheses. But everyone realizes that no one can know with certainty exactly what happened in the unreachable past. All we can do is accumulate circumstantial evidence, just as a district attorney does in attempting to convict someone. If the wall of circumstantial evidence gets high enough and solid enough, if his facts corroborate each other, then we say the DA has proved his case beyond reasonable doubt. The evidence has to be solid, and it has to be logical and reasonable. His evidence has to withstand scrutiny. The prosecutor cannot bring into court invisible witnesses we cannot talk to. If new evidence becomes available, he has to consider it fairly. If he doesn't want to do that, the judge should make him do so or disqualify him. Isn't that what science is all about? Collecting data, building and testing theories, and drawing dispassionate, rational conclusions based on all possible alternative interpretations? Truth is what is important. The prejudices of power structure do not constitute a valid falsification of a well-founded hypothesis. Truth is not determined by how many papers are published or how many people believe them, but by which theory best accounts for observed facts, which one is simpler, which one is based on and consistent with experimental testing. The ideas embodied in the electric and the plasma universe, despite many of its founders having won Nobel Prizes, have not been impartially investigated in the Astrophysics Academy. Will it take another several hundred years, as it took Galileo, to gain official acceptance of these electrical hypotheses by those who constitute the power structure in astrophysics? Will science in general become more open to new ideas? Does this question have practical importance? You bet your pocketbook it does. NASA's yearly budget is in the order of $15 billion. That is your tax money. And they have stated openly that they simply will not fund any cosmological research that is adverse to the Big Bang, which for them has become a religious conviction. Even Carl Sagan, who was not a plasma cosmologist, once said, quote, "It is far better to grasp the universe as it really is than to persist in delusion, however satisfying and reassuring." End quote. Why is it so important that plasma cosmology gain wider recognition? The answer is because people want to get it right. Nobody wants to be intellectually deceived and sold an expensive bill of goods that is untrue. Sagan put it this way, quote, "Finding the occasional straw of truth awash in a great ocean of confusion and bamboozle requires intelligence, vigilance, dedication, and courage. But if we don't practice these tough habits of thought, we cannot hope to solve the truly serious problems that face us, and we risk becoming a nation of suckers, up for grabs by the next charlatan who comes along." End quote. These pages have attempted to show that the spokesperson for modern cosmology and astrophysics have become those charlatans, selling their engaging, confusing, mystical tales to the funding agencies and to the innocent public. So, here is the challenge. Right now, the proponents of the electric and plasma universe are gathering outside the fortress of astrophysics and are calling up to the battlements, "You folks up there, raise the shades, open the windows, and look out. Lower the drawbridge! You have been in self-imposed darkness too long. Many advances have been made in an area of engineering science that has been developed since the time you hauled up that drawbridge. It is called experimental electric plasma dynamics. Raise your eyes from your deductive relativistic Newtonian mathematics and look up at the real night sky. It's an electric sky."